Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the seminar of our monthly series where we aim to highlight rigorous research in the scientific study of international migration. We're so glad you could join us today. My name is Clara Dita. I am faculty co-director of IPL, and I'll be moderating this webinar today. So before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. As you can tell, this session is being recorded. A recording of the presentation will be available on the Immigration Policy Lab website and YouTube channel. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. During the last 15 minutes, I will select a few questions for our presenter to answer. And due to our limited time together, we're not going to be able to answer all your questions. At the end of the webinar, we'll send a link to a Google form in the Zoom chat where you can provide feedback and suggest speakers for future seminars. The link can also be found on the Immigration Policy Lab website. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Vicky Fouka. Professor Vicky Fouka is an associate professor of political science and here at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Her research focus is on group identity and in-group, out-group relations and the implications that that has for the design of policies and institutions. Her recent work includes migration and the making of the English middle class, culture and contemporary political preferences, and industry and identity, the migration linkage between economic and cultural change in 19th century Britain. Today's talk is titled Immigration and the Political Behavior of Immigrant-Background Americans. Welcome to our Science of International Migration webinar. Vicky, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Thank you for having me. This is a project that is joined with Marco Tabellini and Ernesto Tiburcio. And it's new work, so it's preliminary and still in progress, but it's also at this stage where I think it could really benefit from feedback. So I'm looking forward to your reactions and suggestions during the Q&A. And so it's a project that comes to add to a growing literature, but also sort of general interest in the political behavior of voters of immigrant background. Oh, sorry, let me make sure I can go through my slides. Yeah, so in the US, this is a large and growing demographic. This figure here on the right is estimates from Pew on the overtime increase in the size of the group of naturalized voters, both in absolute numbers and a share of total eligible voters. So according to the latest estimates from the American Community Survey in 2024, 25 million eligible voters were born abroad. And according to the CPS, another 24 million had at least one foreign-born parent. So in total, about 20% of eligible voters are either first or second generation immigrants. So that's a large enough group worthy, of studying in terms of political behavior, and especially if we think there's something special about their immigration background that affects their preferences and their political priorities. And so a specific reason why, political scientists, but also journalists and pundits have become interested in this group in the US in the last decade or so has been the fact that together with other groups that have traditionally voted for the Democrats, this group has shifted right. So this is kind of well documented. Here's another graph by Pew. This is based on Catalyst, which shows this shift between the last two presidential elections. So in 2020, naturalized citizens voted for Clinton with an estimated 21 percentage point margin. And then in 2024, this gap essentially closed entirely with a big shift to Trump. But this shift to the Republican Party was apparent even earlier. So these are headlines from the New York Times already from 2016, when this question emerges of, why does Trump appeal to immigrant background voters, especially Hispanics, despite his hardline stance on immigration? And it's a shift that's not restricted to Latinos only. It extends to other immigrant background groups like Asian Americans, though it has attracted somewhat less kind of journalistic attention. So in this paper, we turn to this group and do two things. First, we try to document the shift in voter registration data, and we zoom in specifically on naturalized and second generation immigrant voters. So in many studies, immigration background is proxied by ethnicity and race. We'll look at information on the place of birth and also inferred family relationships to examine the evolution of party identification of immigrants over a 10-year period. And second, and I'd say this is our primary interest in this paper, we'll focus on one salient factor that has been discussed a lot as a likely driver of the political behavior of these voters, which is immigration, and specifically undocumented inflows. So just to give you a somewhat more detailed overview of what we do so far, we rely on the L2 dataset, which collects publicly available voter records from US states. And we exploit the fact that for three states, California, North Carolina, and Nebraska, the place of birth of voters is recorded. So we'll use this information to identify foreign-born voters. And then we'll also implement a set of rules to identify likely spouses, partners, and children. So we can examine registration for likely second-generation voters. And we'll follow people over time. So we'll examine mainly shifts within individual. And then we'll look at these shifts, linking them to changes in the estimated number of undocumented immigrants in the voter's county of residence. So we'll focus on Mexican immigration and follow existing work, which uses a data set of consular identification cards issued to Mexican nationals from Mexican consulates in the US as a proxy of unauthorized migration. These are identification cards that are more useful and more frequently used by unauthorized immigrants, and so that they track their numbers pretty closely. So we'll have these numbers as total outflows from Mexican municipalities, and then we'll assign them to US counties based on pre-existing shares of Mexican migrants from those municipalities. So a kind of shift share approach. And then on top of that, we're going to predict these outflows at the level of the Mexican municipality using a set of push factors. So using this predicted number, we'll compare the differential change for immigrants. So the evolution over time in their party identification through registration relative to that of voters who are US born and are of non-immigrant parentage in counties that have higher versus lower changes in predicted Mexican immigration. Okay, so let me start by giving some more context on immigrant political behavior and on the role of immigration, both from what we know in the US, but also kind of more conceptually in terms of the expectations we might have theoretically. So in the US, and despite this rightward shift that I mentioned, immigrants remain predominantly aligned with the Democratic Party. This is true for all groups, regardless of ethnicity or race. Though there's, of course, a lot of heterogeneity. But there's a large proportion of immigrants, as you can see, for example, in the survey, which was commissioned by the LA Times in 2023, who do not strongly identify with either party or are undecided between parties. And that's a higher proportion than we find for voters that do not have immigrant background. So in the literature, which is large and we really don't, do justice to it here, that examines immigrant and minority political behavior, one focus has been to understand, when these voters deviate from their expected democratic identification, which aligns with an agenda that is kind of more pro-immigrant, pro-minority. And so there's one set of explanations which highlights the fact that, there's nothing special about immigrant background voters. Looking at Hispanics, for example, when one accounts for their socioeconomic profile, their income, or other sort of more fixed attitudes or predispositions, like higher religiosity, for instance, in this group, ethnicity doesn't really stand out as a determinant. That's to say, it's just another group of voters with a particular profile which determines their vote, and it's not really about immigration background. And there's also other work that relatedly emphasizes heterogeneity within this group, and the work that's done by attitudes and by identities in determining political preferences. So in other words, there are Hispanics who may prioritize their national identity more, and so may be more likely to vote Republican, just as there are Hispanics who might have more ethnocentric attitudes or more sexist attitudes, and that might be something that drives them to vote for Trump. So as long as one accounts for profiles and preferences in this heterogeneity, there's nothing special about this group of voters. But there's, of course, also scholarship which exactly highlights the role of immigrant background and of immigrant experience as determinant of the vote. So there might be something, for instance, about experienced or perceived discrimination by this group, which might lead them to align more with the Democratic Party. Or explanations relating more to social identity or individual social mobility that may drive somewhat more conservative voting. And so in the last few elections, as immigration became an increasingly politicized topic, more and more journalistic accounts emerged that connect this issue to immigrant political behavior. And so there are those who try to understand why immigrants voted for Trump despite his stance on immigration, maybe due to other issues because they had priorities like inflation or the economy or a more pro-business environment. And on the other hand, there are these accounts on why immigrant background voters may have voted for Trump exactly because of his anti-immigration stance. Because they see border control as an important issue, because they perceive undocumented immigration as unfair. They came here legally, or they faced more difficult conditions than migrants faced during the Biden administration, or because they clearly, in this headline here, they want to distinguish themselves from a group that's also, vilified in the public debate as, criminals, a public threat, and so on. So this is it because of immigration or despite it, I think reflects a kind of broader tension, which is that immigrants may have stronger reasons to support immigration and have pro-immigrant attitudes than non-immigrant background voters, but they may also have stronger reasons to oppose it. And so the literature has examined both sides. In the US, there's a long line of work that has focused on the political mobilization of immigrant minorities in response to anti-immigrant policies or rhetoric. So a kind of identity threat response when their group is perceived as targeted. But as I previewed, there's other work that sort of looks at the heterogeneity in this. Not everyone responds in this way. This could be moderated by identities or by social connections of people to the immigration experience. And then there's work that shows that immigrants in particular may display anti-immigrant attitudes as a means to disassociate themselves from a group that may be perceived as lower in the social hierarchy. And so that's work that builds more on social identity theory, which identifies such behavior of individual distancing and attempted social mobility as a means of increasing one's perception of self by sort of identifying with groups of higher status. And so more generally, and also outside the US, the literature has highlighted different drivers of pro and anti-immigration attitudes of immigrants. There's work, for example, that looks at how the commonality of experience increases pro-immigration attitudes. People who themselves have migration background are reminded of that, may become more pro-immigrant. Or focusing, for instance, on differences across generations. Those who are closer to the immigration experience might be more sympathetic to new migrants. And there's work that shows that immigrants respond to new immigration by becoming more anti-immigrant and by distancing. But it's also important to highlight that even beyond all of these sort of more psychological considerations, there might be material reasons why immigrants oppose immigration more. There is, for example, research that has pointed out that to the extent that immigration, especially low-skilled and undocumented immigration, has any negative economic effects, those might actually be more concentrated to closer substitutes who tend to be other immigrants. And so that holds for labor markets. It might also be true in general for impacts like crowding or strain on local resources. So there are mixed expectations, and it's not clear which side might dominate in driving these responses. So we're going to look at this empirically in the US, and I'll tell you a little bit about our data. Our main source is L2. L2 is one of those providers who collect and standardize voter records. These are public records which are released by states shortly after each election. And so this data set contains a set of variables which are recorded by the states, for instance, name, address, gender, party registration, whether the person voted, and marital status. And then it augments that with additional variables, for example, race and ethnicity or income, which are modeled, they're inferred from the observed information. So we'll focus on the three states I mentioned, California, North Carolina, and Nebraska. Which are the three states that consistently record place of birth for most voters. They also sort of represent states with varying proportions of immigrants. So the foreign-born are close to 30% in California, but closer to 10% in North Carolina and 5% in Nebraska. So there's kind of the full range, and similar percentages for people who have foreign-born parents. So our main means of identifying immigrants is place of birth, which is recorded for a majority of people in the states, though a lower proportion in Nebraska. It's not very systematic, so we have to kind of clean it ourselves, and it's not always very detailed. So for North Carolina, for example, we only know whether someone is foreign-born, but not exactly where they were born. So we'll use that information for some of our analysis at a loss of sample size. And we'll also use information on race and ethnicity. This is inferred by L2 based on last name and place of residence. And it takes on hundreds of values, which we harmonize to examine some specific subgroups. And as a third step, we will use information in L2 to infer which voters might be members of the same family. So marital status is provided in the voter file for heterosexual couples. And so we'll use that. And we will also assign likely partners when the marital status is listed as non-traditional, people live together and have less than 18 years of age difference, if that's the smallest difference in the household. And then we will also identify as children people who have the same last name and an age difference over 18 years. So once we have identified a couple, we will assign the children to both parents, regardless of whether they share the same last name with both parents. So they can be identified as children of an immigrant mother, even though they might not have the same last name as the mother. So based on these rules, and for the main analysis I'll show today, we construct four groups: naturalized voters who are foreign-born, second-generation voters who are the likely children of the foreign-born. So to be in this category, children will have to actually have lived with their parents for at least 1 year that we observe them in the data. And then we'll have two groups of US-born people, white, who are those who have European or Anglo ethnicity/race, Finnish, Italian, Australian, and others, for instance, Hispanic or Pakistani might fall in this category. And for now, anyone who has a missing place of birth will be omitted from this analysis. So these estimates correlate quite well with both census population counts and with ACS estimates. I only want to show you this table here for naturalized citizens and for adult children of migrant citizens. So you can see that the correlation is strong and that we're basically essentially undercounting both populations, but not by a lot for naturalized citizens. We are more severely undercounting the second generation. So we're really underestimating the number, but that's expected because we're only looking at people who have lived with their parents at some point. Even for the naturalized, some of them might be people who are missing place of birth, so we wouldn't capture them. But overall, it's strongly correlated. And so with regards to the characteristics of those groups, you can see that the naturalized and the US-born white are pretty comparable in terms of age, gender, and inferred household income. The group that stands out more, and again, that's expected based on how we identify them, as the second generation, which tends to be younger and also skews somewhat male and has a somewhat higher income. Okay, so the information on party registration takes on three values. I just wanted to point out here that this is really a lower bound of shifts in political behavior because it's infrequently updated. And so we see very rare switches. People usually register to vote either when they move and they change address, or when they change some important information about themselves, like their name, if they get married, for instance, and they change their last name, or when they register a vehicle in the DMV and they're prompted to register. So only rarely do they register intentionally with the party. So in our data, only 4% of voters switch across any of these three categories, and 2% of voters switch from Democrat to Republican. So, party registration also correlates very strongly with electoral support at the county level. This has been shown by other work as well. It's not really worth dwelling on it for this presentation. Instead, I can show you the evolution of Republican registration by group in our data for this period. First, so that you see that Republican registration rates are lower for all the immigrant and non-white groups than they are for whites throughout the entire period. But there's already a noticeable shift that you can see, especially after 2018. And so it's worth zooming in because this graph shows it even more starkly. It expresses this shift as a percentage point change relative to 2014 values. So you can see that Republican registration is generally declining, but it sort of reverses after 2018. And really the group for which this happens first and shows the most pronounced shift is naturalized voters. So this is the group with the steepest increase. So this is a pattern that is quite general. What we do here is essentially to present estimates from individual level regressions of an indicator for Republican registration on group by year fixed effects. So this essentially is plotting the differential evolution of each group relative to 2014. And each of these graphs just includes different sets of covariates. So we can include state fixed effects, for example. We see that this pattern holds within state. We can account for age and differential gender by county year trends to account for the fact that men and women may have trended differently during this period, which we kind of know is the case. And it looks pretty similar, and it also looks similar when we restrict attention to the same voter over time. So when we include individual fixed effects, and in fact, for this group of voters who have been observed to vote in different elections, this shift is higher. We can restrict it further to consistent voters, those who have voted in at least 5 elections. And so it's worth looking at this difference between consistent voters and others, because it seems that consistent voters are more Republican and shifting more Republican. So there's a shift towards the Democrats coming, I guess, from new voters who are entering the pool of eligible voters. Okay, so we want to connect this shift, which you see emerges essentially starting 2020, to one of the developments of this period, which tracks pretty closely in time, and that is the rise in undocumented immigration. So there's a continuous rise until 2018, and then it was curbed during and after the Obama administration. But due to a combination of factors, especially economic collapse in Venezuela, political crisis in Central America, and also immigration policy in the US, the number of undocumented migrants rises to a record high after 2020. And so even though many irregular migrants during this period come from places like Venezuela, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Central America in general, our measure of undocumented inflows in this paper is going to be migrants from Mexico for a number of reasons. First, despite the rise in the number of these groups, Mexico remains the largest origin for undocumented inflows. So it's estimated to be 5.5 million, or about 40% of estimated undocumented inflows in 2023. And in our 3 states of interest, it is the primary origin of migrants, so 17% of the total migrant population. But most importantly, the data that we will rely on, which has been used by Ernesto in another paper and others before him, to construct estimates of undocumented inflows, are data from Mexico. So I'll tell you a little bit more about this data set. It's called Matrículas Consulares. So these are basically identification cards which are issued by Mexican consulates in the US to Mexican nationals. People must schedule an appointment and present proof of Mexican origin and US residence when appearing at the consulate. And so any Mexican national can apply. But these are identification cards that are particularly useful to people who cannot provide proof of US issued identification, but might require it for different activities, like for opening a bank account, for example. And so they are more useful for unauthorized migrants. Ernesto in previous work and Caballero and co-authors who introduced this data set show that it tracks both in levels and in changes the estimated population of unauthorized migrants as estimated in different ways through the census. It doesn't track, especially the new arrivals, and it doesn't track as closely the population of authorized migrants. So it can be taken as a proxy for the former, but not for the latter. And so the data that we have is individual level until 2020, but municipal level at the level of the Mexican municipality after that. So we'll focus on new ID cards issued, not renewals. And we'll basically use them aggregated at the level of the Mexican municipality. So how do we connect these data sets together? We estimate individual level regressions. I should say that for this analysis, we'll focus only on the naturalized second generation and US born white as the base group. We'll examine mainly Republican registration. We'll also look at Democrats and independents, but also look at whether people voted. And regress this on a measure of predicted unauthorized Mexican inflows at the county level. So I'll tell you in just a second how we compute that. And we account for a set of fixed effects. So first of all, we look at within-person changes. So we include individual fixed effects. And then we will control for county by year fixed effects. So we will account for overall partisan trends in a county. Our focus will be the differential effect for immigrants relative to US-born whites in a county. And we'll also control for group-specific state trends. For instance, the naturalized in California might be trending very differently from the naturalized in Nebraska. And also group by age group fixed effects. So our coefficient of interest is going to be this differential effect of immigration on Republican identity changes for these groups of immigrant background voters relative to US-born whites. So, just to make this a little bit more concrete, because there's like lots of fixed effects. So what is the identifying variation that we exploit? You can consider the example of comparing within-person changes. So for the same person over time, for 2 similarly aged women, let's say 2 68-year-old women, both in Santa Clara County, California, One is a naturalized foreign born. The other one is a US born white. And this is net of the mean Republican registration for naturalized or US born whites in California overall, and net of the country level Republican registration for women in that age group, which for us here is between 65 and 73. Okay. How do we construct this estimate of predicted immigration? We take the total number of consular ID cards issued to people from a particular municipality of origin in Mexico. That's the total estimate of the outflow, and we'll allocate it to counties in the US based on the initial shares of migrants from that municipality in the baseline period, which we take here to be 2002 to 2006, divided by the county population in 2010. So these are based on consular ID cards issued in that early period to people from that particular municipality in Mexico. And instead of using the actual outflow from a municipality to avoid the fact that that might be depending on the evolution of conditions in US destination counties, which might correlate with political trends, we will predict that using a type of zero-stage regression, so using push factors in the Mexican municipality of origin. And we rely on two sets of push factors. One set is climatic, the idea that climate shocks might affect agricultural production and through it out migration. So for now, we're using annual deviation in mean temperature and precipitation relative to long run means, lagged. We have an additional set of socioeconomic predictors at the municipality level, such as maternal and infant mortality rates and spending at the municipality level. So for most of the analysis, we'll use both, but we show that things are robust to relying only on the climate push factors. So one thing that should be mentioned here is that we don't really do a proper IV. We just use the actual prediction because we don't have disaggregated data for the early period. But if we look just at data from until 2020, we have a pretty strong first stage. We slightly overestimate the number of observed inflows, but I think the reason for that is that California was a major recipient until 2020, and then immigrants start diversifying in their origin, so we have less. We're less accurate in that prediction. Okay, and I can. Yeah. Okay. So even if these outflows from Mexican municipalities are exogenous, the counties that receive these shocks may not be randomly exposed. That's a recent insight by Borussia and Hall. So some counties, because of where they are located, closer to the border, for example, their size or historical ties, might systematically absorb larger inflows and also experience conditions that would correlate with more Republican voting. For example, recent work shows that border counties are more exposed to the opioid epidemic, and that has in itself an effect on Republican voting. So we adjust for that by adjusting for this non-random exposure as Borosiak and Hall recommend, which essentially is permuting our vector of shifts 1,000 times and subtracting this estimated exposure from our instrument. So I can show you what predicted immigration looks like in our data. Essentially declining until 2020 and increasing thereafter, kind of tracking the broader trends in undocumented immigration that I showed you earlier. Okay, so for identification, essentially combining our strategy of fixed effects in the instrument, the identifying assumption is that when we control for these trends, when we account for county by year trends, for example, the change within individual for immigrants and US-born whites would be similar in counties with more versus less predicted migration. So a lot of our identification rests on this fact that we look at these differential trends between immigrants and whites, and we absorb a lot of the action that might happening at the county level over time through county by year fixed effects. But on top of that, adjusting for this non-random exposure, these changes in Mexican inflows, especially predicted by somewhat exogenous push factors at the origin, should be uncorrelated with trends in voter registration. So that's what we rely on for identification. So what do we find? This table shows the differential effect of predicted Mexican immigration on naturalized and second generation voters relative to US born whites. That's the omitted group here. And so relative to this group, Republican registration increases for both of these immigrant background groups with a roughly double magnitude for the naturalized. And so just to contextualize this, for the naturalized specifically, the average yearly change in unauthorized Mexican immigration explains about 9% of the mean yearly Republican gains. On average, the yearly switches to Republican registration, which is about 2%, as I mentioned in our data. So that's interesting to think in the context of the fact that Mexican unauthorized immigration is estimated to be 40% of total unauthorized immigration. So we could double this if we were to account for all unauthorized immigration in this period. One thing we could expect is that increases in Republican registration might go together with increases in Democratic registration, and that would be reflective of more of a polarization or more heterogeneity within this group. But this is actually not what we find. What we find is that there's a shift away from the Democrats and independents. For the naturalized, the shift to Republicans comes from both formally registered Democratic voters and independents. And for the second generation, we don't see switches across parties, but we see independents switching to Republican. And so that's also kind of interesting, and I think it tracks insights from the literature, which would indicate that partisan identities are more fluid and less entrenched for immigrants. So that's why we might be more likely to observe switches across parties, which is otherwise a pretty rare phenomenon. Well, when we look at US born voters, we don't really see that kind of switch, but we see more shifts from the independent group. These are potentially more stable in their partisan predispositions. I don't know how much time I have, but I think I'll skip this in the interest of time and can return to it if there is if there's interest. We can examine this effect in its temporal evolution. So here we interact predicted migration with year indicators, and we find this to be quite stable over time. For the naturalized, as we saw in the aggregate data, it increases already in 2018. It's generally somewhat larger in the later period after 2020. But interestingly, for the naturalized, we see this increase already during the first Trump presidency. So we don't really find any effect on the probability of voting, like the differential probability of voting for immigrants. We don't find any effect on differential moving, either across counties or across census blocks. And we can, look at people who remained even in the same address during this entire period, and we still find this shift. There are a few things that we did in addition as checks for identification and for robustness, which I'll, for the most part, skip unless you're interested. I mean, one thing to say is that we have a bunch of more demanding specifications. So, for example, we can account for groups in different counties that have different characteristics, different initial levels of unemployment or income or voting for Republican, to be in different trends, and that doesn't affect the differential effect we find. But what I would like to highlight, because I think it's interesting, is that this differential effect that we find for immigrant background voters persists even when we account for different income. So when we interact unauthorized Mexican migration at the county level with a measure of baseline income, the first time a person's income is observed, we do see that people of lower income are more likely to shift Republican in response to unauthorized immigration. But there's on top of that still a differential effect for migrant origin. So it's not just income, which in itself might be predictive and interesting. It's something about migrant background. Okay, so why is this the case? I mean, admittedly, this part of our paper is still underdeveloped, and we only have some suggestive evidence. But I'll show it as some of it is interesting, and I'm actually really interested in hearing more ideas and more ways in which we can examine this. So what we do for now is to consider three dimensions of heterogeneity as suggestive of underlying mechanisms that could potentially be at play. One is the extension of temporary protected status during this period of 2020 to 2024. This is one of the major developments in immigration policy, which it was discussed that this triggered concerns of fairness among earlier immigrants and voters of immigrant background. And it might have also, especially in places that had a lot of migrants who received temporary protected status, increased the salience of immigration, potentially increasing incentives to distance from newcomers, from a group that was cast as particularly salient and threatening. So we can examine whether we see stronger effects in places that had more TPS recipients. The second thing we look at is ethnicity and national origin. And so this relates to a literature that looks at the role of co-ethnicity or cultural proximity more general, and how this may either dampen anti-immigrant attitudes or actually make them more pronounced or even increase incentives to distance from the group. For instance, groups that may share similarities with a group that is facing hostility or discrimination might have more pronounced incentives to actually distance themselves from that group, as some of the work of Claire has shown. So we can look whether this effect is more pronounced for Hispanics or even for people of Mexican origin. And then we also look at income, thinking about these material drivers and the fact that the effects of undocumented immigration might be more negative for those who have lower socioeconomic status. So starting with a TPS, essentially TPS granted migrants from particular countries who were already in the US but did not have a regular status, a temporary work authorization and the permission to stay. And so beneficiaries were nationals of countries that faced either humanitarian or environmental crisis or where it was deemed unsafe to return. And the number of TPS recipients increased a lot during this period, and half of the growth was driven by Venezuelan beneficiaries. So the Department of Homeland Security provides data on recipients by state and nationality, but not by county. So for this analysis that we do here, we essentially project this state level number onto counties based on initial shares of people from different nationalities at the county level as we observed them in the ACS in 2006 to 2010. So here we're making the assumption that their distribution resembles the existing distribution of their compatriots, which is not exactly accurate. We can evaluate this at the state level. We somewhat overestimate the number of TPS recipients in California, underestimated in the other two states. So we will correct for that at the state level. And then we will divide counties to those who are above and below the 75th percentile of TPS recipients to see if the effect differs there. And we actually find no heterogeneity in this effect. This is somewhat different from our main result, I should say, because here we're only looking at data after 2020. And it's very suggestive. It doesn't necessarily mean that fairness and concern with TPS was not a driver of behavior, but it doesn't seem to be particularly strong driver of heterogeneity in voter registration. The second thing that we look at is ethnicity. So here we can distinguish naturalized and second generation voters by whether they are Hispanic or not. Again, generally the heterogeneity that we find is not huge, but suggestively the effect seems to be stronger for the naturalized in general and for the Hispanic origin group among those among second generation immigrants. So thinking about similarity or ethnicity, co-ethnicity as a driver of more pro-immigration stance, less shift to the Republic. And this actually seems to be the other way around in what we find here, which would be consistent with some of these social incentives for distancing or drawing clear boundaries between groups that otherwise are actually similar. And in fact, we can see this even more if we disaggregate the Hispanic group to those who are of Mexican origin and other Hispanics. Here, we're losing the entire state of North Carolina, where we don't have information on the exact place of birth. But the tendency is for a stronger effect for Mexicans, though we still see a pretty pronounced effect for the naturalized and second generation Hispanics. But the estimates for Mexicans, even though not significantly different, kind of stand out. So again, that would point in the direction of more similarity and closeness to this group of Mexican unauthorized migrants as a driver of a bigger shift to the Republicans. So that's consistent with some of these social identity boundary mechanisms, but we can also look at differential effects by household income. So here we split by baseline income, and for all the groups, the tendency is for those who have below median household income at baseline to show a more pronounced shift in response to unauthorized immigration. And so even here, there's some dimension of similarity, in this case, socioeconomic. And that might point to some sort of more material or economic nature considerations in that groups that are more similar, closer to unauthorized migrants who of themselves are of lower socioeconomic status and income are the groups that show the most pronounced shift. I think that even based on this, we cannot really rule out social channels, and that these are groups that share a lot, potentially share the same spaces, maybe have kind of more of an incentive to distance themselves. But overall, we combine this piece that effects are more pronounced for below median income with the fact that in our data and without much heterogeneity, we do find a negative effect on household income of unauthorized Mexican immigration for all of these groups differentially relative to US-born whites, I'm reminding you here. And so Ernesto has a separate paper in which he looks at the overall effects of undocumented migration estimated in a similar way. And he shows there that even though it did not affect wages or employment in a county on average, it did have a more pronounced negative effect on sectors that were sort of migrant intensive and a marginal increase in poverty. And that would be consistent with a more negative effect concentrated in groups that are potentially lower socioeconomic status and more similar to incoming migrants. So I think I'll leave it at that. I know I'm out of time. I haven't monitored the messages. So what we find is that unauthorized Mexican immigration induces a Republican shift among naturalized and second generation voters that seems to be more pronounced for Hispanic and specifically Mexican origin voters and those of lower income. This is consistent with social channels of similarity that we really cannot rule out, but I think this differential economic impact for some groups appears to play at least some role, and I think deserves more attention and more examination on our part. We have some ongoing work. We're trying to look at survey data to understand some more concrete concerns that migrant background voters might have, and especially some of these social mechanisms. And one of the things we want to examine is the role of political campaigns that were targeted to migrant background voters, especially from the Republican Party. This is something that drew media attention for specific, swing states like Arizona, but also in Florida. And together with that, perhaps less attention on the part of the Democratic Party. So that I think is an interesting top-down mechanism that we're hoping to investigate further. So I'll stop at this point to leave some time for your questions and reactions. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vicky. I cannot, somebody could allow me to turn my video on. That'd be great. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Vicky. Fantastic talk. I'm going to start us off real quickly with a question I had. When you were talking about the data on place of birth, I'm wondering what kind of bias might be introduced by the fact that you get rid of all the folks who did not put in their place of birth, especially if, could you be overestimating the rightward shift if we're thinking there's some omitted variable that predicts confidence in putting down your place of birth and also turning rightward and also responding to higher unauthorized Mexican immigration.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And we're doing some things on this, but potentially we could be doing more. So I also welcome suggestions about like the concrete concern that we might have. There's a pretty high percent of missingness, right? And for some states, especially like Nebraska, it's 50% of people who don't write anything. So one of the things that we did was, first of all, to see how overall missingness correlates with electoral returns and support for different parties at the county level. So, is it the case that we see more missing observations in places that tend to vote Republican versus Democrat? And so there doesn't seem to be a strong correlation there. So that's one check that we can do. I think perhaps what we're more worried about, because what I just mentioned would probably be dealt with by the county by year fixed effects anyways, is the differential effect for immigrants, right? Like, are we missing more immigrant background people in particular places that might also skew more Republican or Democrat? That's, I think, harder to assess. We've tried some things. We've tried to see, given, for example, the distribution of immigrants that we estimate in the data where we have birthplace. Do we think that that looks similar? Like the mix of missingness is going to be, the mix of immigrant versus non-immigrant background is going to be similar in the portion that is missing. And it seems to be the case. Like when we estimate these regressions, it looks almost like a similar mix, let's say. So people who are of immigrant background and those who are U.S. born whites would tend at the same rate to not like put down their place of birth. But I know that there's more that we can do there.
Great. Now opening it up to questions from the audience. First question from Immigration Lab asks, could a causal variable be naturalization process rather than immigration?
Mm, so I think I need to hear a little bit more information on the specific either concern or channel that you have in mind, and as a mediator or like as a confounder of unauthorized inflows. Yeah, I'm not sure I
Yeah,
really understood that, but if you can clarify, I'd be really happy
yeah.
to consider it.
So let's see if Immigration Lab wants to clarify that through the Q&A. In the meantime, we'll turn to Ahmet Guleg, who's a postdoc here. Thank you so much for this great talk. I wanted to ask whether you looked at employment and income effects of the shock. My prior is that the negative impacts would be more pronounced for low socioeconomic status men and less so for women. And I wonder whether
Mm.
this could help you distinguish among your suggested mechanisms. If income effects are driving your results, then a testable implication is that the transition to a Republican Party would also be more pronounced among men and less so for women.
Yeah, that's actually a great suggestion that I hadn't thought of. We haven't actually split, we haven't disaggregated by gender, which we wanted to do just because, it's been one of those drivers of Republican vote that have been discussed. But it's a good point that if this is an economic effect and if it's concentrated in sectors like construction, for example, then it should be more pronounced for men. I mean, we don't have a ton of variables, right? Like L2 gives us inferred income, and that's the one that we've looked at. Ernesto has another paper, as I mentioned, where he looks at overall county effects. He doesn't find big effects on employment, but he does find effect for migrant intensive sectors like construction. So there are definitely effects. They seem to be concentrated potentially for migrant groups, but they might correlate with co-ethnicity, and so by splitting by gender might be a way for us to disaggregate that. So we'll definitely try that. Thanks for the suggestion.
Our next question is from Jay McCann. Says, thanks for the great talk. Regarding possible mechanisms, do election results since 2024 offer any leverage? Some exit surveys suggest that there has been movement among these voters away from Republicans due to the immigration
Yeah,
crackdown. This could point towards attitudinal variables rather than economic drivers of partisanship.
yeah, that's a really great point, and it's definitely on our to-do list to incorporate. later rounds as they come in, or looking at evidence from surveys in our setup is a little difficult, and I put it here in ongoing work, but actually we don't really have that much leverage to use the variation that we're using across counties. That's something we can do with the voter registration data, but not with surveys. So we either have to wait for later rounds of data to see how this entire ICE discussion and immigration enforcement affected things, or maybe we can get something from these surveys. I mean, just, from what one reads in the media, you still see quite a bit of support for enforcement, just not the way in which it's done and the methods that are used. So I'm not so clear that this is really I mean, probably there's going to be some shift, but maybe not as big as we expect. And in addition to your point, I do think that attitudinal variables probably play an independent role, even if there is some economic mechanism also working in kind of the longer run.
We have a question from our very own Duncan Lawrence, executive director here. He's trying to understand the data and the selection into the sample, especially for the population that gets a consular ID versus the population that doesn't. Is it likely the farther from a consulate, the less likely you are to get one? This may not matter for the specification, but just curious about the data.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I'm not even sure we have a really good way of assessing that. Who is more likely to select into who of the Mexican migrants and potentially unauthorized Mexican migrants is more likely to select into getting a consular ID card. Um, yeah, I don't know. I'm actually trying to think if that would matter in any way, which I don't know. I think that's something that I need to think more about, but I'm not sure we have a way of assessing this in the first place. I wonder if for the earlier period where we have individual level data, there might be a way to somehow link this to place of residence to understand something about the profile of these voters, of these migrants. But I don't really have a good answer. I need to think more about that.
Um, a second question is on the TPS dynamics, temporary protective status. So groups in the 90s who received TPS and then were able to naturalize might have very different perspectives on more recent TPS designations.
Yeah,
So wondering about the expectation on the direction of fairness.
yeah. Um, I mean, actually, I'm thinking of this as more as a suggestion. If we could, for example, isolate the impact for counties where there might be a higher concentration of these groups that naturalized earlier, and make this a more targeted comparison, we might actually get something more out of this heterogeneity with TPS. I mean, one prior would be, and what one reads about, that the process is at least perceived to have been much easier for migrants now. People had to jump through fewer hoops, at which it was much easier to get the status than earlier waves of migrants. And so there might be, this concern about fairness, or at least that was our starting point. Could also go the other way, but I think I'll try to follow up on this idea that we might be able to make this comparison more like a closer, more direct comparison. I think that's a good thought.
I had another thought about kind of a literature that you don't mention in here, but I think might be relevant is a literature on the effect of exposure, kind of the negative
Hmm.
effects of exposure. And it's a
Yeah,
literature that looks at anti-migrant attitudes among the hosts.
right.
But, I thought about Dan Hopkins' work that
Yeah,
shows that, when there's a shift in the demographics, it doesn't really affect attitudes unless it's also covered by the media, unless it's highly salient.
yeah,
Seems like your work seems to kind of it doesn't contradict it, but it's not exactly the same thing here. It doesn't seem to be mediated by or moderated by by salience. It just seems to be a direct effect of this like increase in unauthorized migration. So I'm just wondering if
yeah.
you've thought about that, the relationship to that literature.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I skipped talking about this literature that mainly focuses on attitudes of non-migrants, just because it's a big literature. It clearly connects, and we'll definitely consider it. Um, but I don't think it necessarily contradicts it in the sense that we are observing kind of this average effect in a period during which migration was overall highly politicized and highly salient. Um, you might imagine that this is a moderator that's kind of omitted in the analysis that we do, but it is there. Places that receive more of these migrants might also see more salience of this, and we're just not measuring it, but it is actually there. And part of what I wrote here in our plan for next steps, looking, for example, at targeted political campaigns, I think one could include salience in the media and like targeted salience, for example, from particular sides as one of the drivers of it. Like I think this might be going on actually. We're not looking at it directly, but it doesn't mean that it's not there in the background.
Totally, I agree. Well, we've reached 9:30, so I want to thank you very much, Vicky, for a fascinating presentation, and thank you all in the audience for joining and for your engagement and questions. I have to close now, but I'm already looking forward to the next seminar on April 9th with Zeke Hernandez from the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.